Tripod, the official Trinity University Press podcast, invites authors, journalists, community leaders, and other guests to engage in exploratory, informative discussions on the subject of people, places, and the planet.
I'm Lily Brennan, and welcome back to another episode of Tripod, the official podcast of the Trinity University Press. Joining me today is Dr. Kelly Gray Carlisle, a professor of creative writing at Trinity University, author of the memoir Are All Shipwrecks, and essays that have been shortlisted as Best American Essays, as well as the recent recipient of the 2024 Trinity President's Award for her outstanding service and support to her students. Also joining us today is Andrew Porter, the director of the creative writing program at Trinity University, author of the recent release of The Imagined Life, and the recipient of many accolades, including, most recently, his short story Angelo being selected for the 2025 Best American Short Story Collection. Andrew and Kelly are here to discuss how writing, reading, and research are excellent ways for all people to engage with their environment, communities, and each other. Welcome, Kelly and Andrew.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us, Lily.
Yeah, I'm so glad you guys are here. I mean, obviously, I know you both dearly as my professors, which is especially I was researching for this, and I was like, oh my god, you guys are even more awesome than I thought you were. Obviously, just from hearing you speak in class and how intelligent and experienced you both are, I'm like, okay, obviously they know what they're doing, but this was a whole new kind of look on it as bringing people in to talk about things on a podcast. I was like, okay, I'm talking to the right people. I'm bringing the right people into this more than just because I'm excited to talk to my professors about what they do. But I know I gave a little bit of background information on the both of you, but if you could both just give a little bit more information of just kind of where you're from, your life in San Antonio, recent writing things. Do you want to start us off?
Sure. So I grew up in Pennsylvania. I came to Trinity in, I think, 2004. So I've been here about 20 years. Yeah, which is hard to believe. And I came here to teach fiction writing. At that point, there was nobody teaching creative writing at all. And it's been wonderful seeing the program grow. And it's also been wonderful just sort of starting or continuing a career here as a writer.
So I'm from LA originally. Lived in Tennessee, Nebraska, and Iowa before I moved here to Texas in 2011. So I've been at Trinity for 13 years teaching creative nonfiction writing. And yeah, I love it. I say very often that if I didn't need the money, I would do this job for free. Working with students like you, Lily, and getting to write and getting paid for it and getting to read, it's just a dream come true. So thank you, Andrew, since you hired me.
Well, and now, so your specialty, at least to my knowledge, is more short fiction, the novel fiction writing, and then Dr. Carlisle is more nonfiction, immersive journalism. But you also do a lot of creative writing as well. Do you want to just expand a bit on the differences between your genres, or if you've had any crossover? I don't know if you've written any nonfiction.
Yeah, I have written some nonfiction, here and there. I don't tend to do a lot of personal stuff. It's usually related to writing. But I actually, before Kelly arrived, I taught nonfiction here, and I have a deep love for nonfiction, and I'm really interested particularly in books that kind of blur the two genres. And so I think there's a lot of overlap between the two, but I think the lines have become blurrier over the years.
I would agree with that, absolutely. My training in graduate school is actually in fiction writing. They didn't have a nonfiction program where I did my PhD. But I also discovered pretty early in my graduate career that I sucked at making things up. And that also I had a real story to tell, which is in my first memoir about my childhood. And so in creative nonfiction, right, it's absolutely creative writing. We use elements from fiction writing and poetry, images, metaphors, dialogue, scene, setting, characterization, the whole works to tell a factually accurate story. And I too am interested sort of where that line blurs, right? Because I think our lives as humans, our minds, we're constantly in the realm of imagination and thinking of things and fantasizing. And I just feel like where those lines blur can actually say a lot of something that's really true in a nonfiction sense about a narrator or about a story.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think I'm also, at least as my time as a student, also interested in kind of that crossover there. And I think, at least for what I've experienced a lot, is with nonfiction, it's I'll be researching something about a topic I'm interested in, and I'll kind of be inspired to write something less factual. I think, at least for being in both of your classes, I kind of was starting to write something for our topics in creative writing class, our adventure writing class. And then I was like, well, but what if this adventure ended up being like not real at all? And then I wrote a completely different piece that I actually brought to Professor Porter's class. So I totally agree that there's like a lot of exciting crossover there. But I just wanted to talk a bit about your individual works. You're both coming out with exciting new work. And we have The Imagined Life is already released, correct?
Well, maybe at the time of this podcast, it will have been released, but it's coming out officially April 15th.
Okay, can you tell us a bit more about The Imagined Life? Just kind of the process of it, its subject matter, any other facts you want to share?
Sure. I mean, it was, it kind of was written during COVID. I had a sabbatical that kind of happened during COVID, and I had to figure out what am I going to focus on in my sabbatical. And I had a few different novel projects in mind. But this one kind of jumped out at me, partly because it was set in Southern California, where I have deep connections, and my family has been, since the late 90s. It was a place that during COVID, I missed going out there. I missed my family. And it was very hard not to travel. I think a lot of people felt that way. And I thought, okay, I have this sabbatical. I'm going to be isolated. Where would I like to go in my imagination? And it really grew out of kind of wanting to be in California and be in Southern California and kind of to be in a place that I love. And it also is set partly in the 80s. So it was about going back to a simpler time in certain ways. But it also grew out of kind of the premise of a guy who's in maybe his late 40s, who's recently separated from his wife and decides to use this opportunity to kind of go back, retrace what happened to his father, who disappeared in 1984 when he was 12 years old. And he goes back and he talks to his father's old colleagues and friends to kind of figure out what happened. And so it's a little bit of a mystery, but it's not like a mystery in the traditional sense. So it's very much a California novel. Kelly will have to fact check me. But yeah, I mean, so that's the gist of it. It's maybe a longer answer than you want.
No, that was a great answer. And I love that it's like the imagined life, as in being in, kind of COVID era and being like, oh, this is the life I'm imagining. I could maybe not tracing, the death of a family member, but being in California and being able to go out and about and talk to people. Did you do any in-person research for that? Did you make a trip out, or did you just kind of talk to people you wanted to include?
I mean, I've spent a lot of time in that area where it's set, both in Los Angeles and kind of Orange County, and so I felt very comfortable writing about that setting without doing research. But then, after it had already been accepted for publication and I was kind of moving into the final editing stages, I decided I should take a trip to kind of after the fact, fact check myself. So it's set in Fullerton, California, which is south of LA. And so I had spent some time in Fullerton, but not a lot. So I went there and I spoke to people in Fullerton. I went and spoke to a research librarian at the local library. I spoke to this guy in a record shop, and I just and I drove around Fullerton, and I just kind of made sure that everything that I wasn't certain about in the novel was factually right. And it turned out that it was generally correct. So the research happened after the fact, which I know is very different than your experience.
We would probably do it reverse, do the research before the writing. But I like the idea of okay, let me make sure that I'm not biasing myself of my memories of this and going out and fact checking, and the idea of going out and speaking to people in that area also sounds really exciting. I've never done that for a story, but I think that's something I would definitely like to explore. But I know, Dr. Carlisle, your basis for your Durham Cathedral related book, I mean, you really went out to London and did so much research. Do you want to talk a bit about that experience?
So in 2018 and 2019, thanks to a generous research lead from Trinity, I was able to move with my family to Durham, England, which is in the northeast. If you've ever taken the train from London up to Edinburgh, you've passed through Durham and you have seen this massive building from your train that's called Durham Cathedral. It's a 900-year-old cathedral church. It was built by the Normans beginning in 1093. Lived in Durham for the year with my family to immerse myself in all things cathedral, right? And so This cathedral is a UN World Heritage Site. It's architecturally incredibly important to European architecture. It was the first place a pointed arch was used, which, if you know anything about architecture, pointed arches can bear a lot more weight. So it was bigger and prettier and more cutting edge than any cathedral that had ever been built. And so I spent a year there trying to see what a year in the life of a cathedral was. It's an active church, so I went to all the services for a year with my family in the daily life of this place, which has a children's choir, right? Like that stereotypical boys choir and girls choir of English cathedral music. I went and got to know the people that ring the bells. I got to know the janitors. I got to know the people who are like lay assistants. I got to know the clergy who live there, be a tour guide there. I had all these experiences, and most of all, I got to explore places that are off limit to the public. The dungeon for monks, for badly behaved medieval monks, the Triforium, which is one of the high places, even to the very top of the clerestory where nobody is allowed. I managed to talk myself in. And so it was an experience that I will remember the rest of my life clearly and have wonderful memories from it. But what took me by surprise was that everything took me by surprise. And there were things that I learned about that cathedral or things that became issues in that cathedral that I had no idea. And so a really big one, and I know it's sort of more the focus of this podcast, was actually, ecological concerns, right? This is a very artificial human-made structure in the culture-nature binary. It's as culture as you can get. And yet it was totally come through with the natural environment, with ecological concerns. In fact, you can look at it and see the whole history of the Anthropocene. And I found that really, really compelling.
Trinity University Press is a mission-driven publisher committed to civic engagement with timely ideas facilitated by the publication of print and digital books, related media, creative and educational programs, and other activities that help us all better understand our place in a crowded world. For more than 50 years, Trinity University Press has published more than 225 titles and organized thousands of events, all focused on broadening our understanding of many impactful subjects, from human relationships with our physical environments to social equity and justice. For more information about Trinity University Press, visit tupress.org.
Yeah, I mean, I was just like, you were just speaking about that, and I was just like totally drawn onto every word. I mean, I'm not one to necessarily reach for nonfiction all that often, but I mean, that experience sounds like something any fiction writer would also like enjoy doing, and just most people. I don't know if it's, as you're saying, there's a lot of areas that nobody'd been in that you were able to get to, but the experience of picking a location, picking an interest, and being fully immersed in it, is that kind of an adventure that you would recommend other people try? Of like, if there's something you're really interested in, to try and go out and be in it and really get to know it personally?
Absolutely. I mean, I tell my classes in both the intro and probably it's come up in your class as well, like, being a writer, you get this little license to be curious, right? Like, you can follow your curiosity to the ends of the earth. You can immerse yourself in whatever you're interested in, and you have like a go-to surefire reason when someone's questioning why you would uproot your family for a year, why you would go live on a lot less money than maybe you could, right? And that's because you're a writer and you can follow these things and make art out of it. And we talk a lot at Trinity about raising or contributing to our students, helping them to become lifelong learners, right? Being a writer is like the ultimate lifelong learner, and immersing yourself in this kind of project is like the best example of that. Like, it has brought me so much joy and expanded my understanding of the world in so many ways. Yeah. 10 out of 10 recommend.
Yeah, I mean, it's experience. I mean, would you agree as well from the, the short story perspective of like, if you can go out and find those places, even just maybe not all the way in London, but within your own life, is that helpful to crafting stories and expanding yourself as a learner?
Yeah, I mean, setting is, I think, a powerful source of inspiration for fiction. And one thing that I've always felt is that a setting has to be something that you connect with emotionally. Right? That you can't just set something in a random city because you happen to be interested in that city. Like, there has to be something deeper there. When I've written fiction, I've always set it in places where I've had some kind of deep personal connection. And in some cases, like for example, San Antonio, like, I wasn't able to set anything here for probably the first 10 years that I lived here. It was really interesting. And then after my children were born, suddenly I was able to set things here because I began to think of it as my home. And that's true of other settings where I've lived in my life, but there are plenty of places I've lived. Like I lived in Baltimore for a long time. I lived in the Bay Area. I've never been able to, set things in these particular areas. I lived in Iowa. I've never said a single thing in Iowa. And so it's kind of curious, like why do particular settings speak to you? So one thing I encourage my students to think about is like settings that kind of call to them emotionally, because I think there's often conflicts and stuff that are kind of rooted in particular settings for writers. Sometimes you're not even sure why. Sometimes it's a mystery to you. But I feel like paying attention to those settings that kind of speak to you in that way can really be a good starting place.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I hadn't thought about it when you were saying like you hadn't written about San Antonio until your children were born. I was like, I don't think I've written any stories where I've imagined San Antonio as my setting. But I do imagine Chicago as my setting all the time, which is where I was born and raised. And it does stick out so clearly in my mind for so many stories. But I do love the concept of like going. Did you find the Durham Cathedral like where had you been in London previously and you kind of just came across it and you were like, wow, that's really interesting? Or was it something you had found externally and brought you to London?
Sure. So I've been a cathedral fan, which is what I call them. There's a whole community of cathedral fans in the world, and they're just people that love these old churches. My cathedral fandom started when I was a very little girl. I was about 8 or so. I lived in a tenuous, unstable family that was full of love, but it was an interesting upbringing. And somehow I got a copy of the recording of the Old Vic Theater production of Murder in the Cathedral by T.S. Eliot, which is a play about the martyrdom of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I think because my childhood was so messed up, so I listened to this recording like nonstop over and over and over and over again. Like when I was in my room, I was listening to this recording, and it was set in a cathedral. I think that it was about a murder. But when I listened to that recording, what I heard was beauty, and a cathedral seemed like this place that was incredibly safe and warm and holy and friendly, and like just a place that I wanted to be at from this weird play about a guy who was murdered. and so I'd always been that way. And then in college, I went to an Episcopal college, which is a church-based college from the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England, basically. And I met my husband, who's really into choirs. And so for a lot of our young adulthood, we would travel to England with these American choirs to sing at these cathedrals. And so when I knew that I was going to have a research leave coming up, we were actually, I think, at Canterbury Cathedral. And I turned to my husband and I said, wouldn't it be cool to spend a whole year at a cathedral? And he was like, oh my God, that'd be awesome. And so that was sort of where that book idea came from. I contacted a few cathedrals. Durham was the one that said, yes, come. And so that is why I went to Durham.
There's a lot of personal connection there, which I mean, I'm seeing more and more crossover, that blurring of lines between the genres of like having a personal connection to your writing is so critical. It's making it real, and no matter what like genre you're in, not to move away from setting, because I feel like that's so important to all our stories, but I think character and people have also kind of been brought in, as you're saying, the people you spoke to get even into Durham. But I know in your classes, Professor Porter, you're saying you can write your way into a story kind of through a character. And I know with your book, The Imagined Life, you're saying you have this particular character. Did that character kind of come to you first and you wrote your way into the story through him, or was it more your setting? Or
Yeah, it was a kind of combination of both. As I mentioned earlier, the story really grew out of this kind of first chapter that I had, and I'd been working on it like on and off in between stories for a while. I'd kind of tinker with it a little bit, but there was a voice. The narrative voice was something that I felt a kind of urgency in. I felt that there was a story that this person needed to tell. I didn't know what the story was, but I sensed it in the voice. And so as I wrote that first chapter, I was kind of fine-tuning the voice, but I was also exploring the world of what would become the world of the novel. So I was doing both of those things. So I kept adding details, building this sort of Southern California, in this case, backyard setting that starts off the novel, and then also kind of figuring out the tone and making adjustments in the language so that the voice sounded true to me, I guess is the best way to put it. And then I just followed the voice, and I followed his story, and I didn't know what the story was going to be. I knew that at some point his father was going to disappear. I knew in the present story that there was going to be an explanation for why he was separated from his wife. Those were the only things I knew, and I just kind of followed the voice to see what the story would be. And for me, that's, a lot of the stuff I write is first person, and a lot of it grows out of voice and out of kind of discovering the story that the character wants to tell. I'm not a outliner. I don't ever figure out plots ahead of time. I don't ever have any real idea of where any particular project is going. But when I feel there's a kind of authenticity in the voice, and I feel like this person really needs to tell this story, I always just trust that, and usually it delivers me somewhere.
I think to anybody who doesn't write, every day, or maybe isn't their favorite thing or their profession or something like that, I think that concept of I don't know what the story is going to be about, but I'm just going to start writing it is very foreign. Even when I came to Trinity and I had heard that in a couple classes, I was like, I don't know if I've done that. I think a lot of times my stories that I like to write are kind of fully formed in a way. I have some, but now that I've done more writing, I'm sometimes, the ending really just will come at you and kind of surprise you. And I think relying on character and that narrative voice is really important. I don't know if it's different for nonfiction-wise of you kind of do know where your story is going, somewhat. But I think choosing the information and stuff is important. Do you have certain characters that kind of come to you, or is it sort of people you want to interview, people you want to speak to? I know you said you've talked to the janitors, you've talked to all the people that work within a cathedral. Was that a part of your initial plan? Was that important to you?
So there's a cathedral that's a building, right? And then there's a cathedral that's a community. And in fact, the name of my book, the working title, is Holy Man People, which comes from an Anglo-Saxon term for this cathedral community. But any place we come to always through a consciousness, a body, a set of sensory inputs, right? And so in my book, part of what's important is the narrator coming into this new place and exploring it. Equally and more important is the people who are already there. I knew one person when I got there. It was the person I had talked to about coming. Right before I left, it had become my practice to pray for all the people that I knew in this cathedral community at the Shrine of the Saint, because it seemed like a nice thing to do, and it was just a participatory thing that I did to pray at the shrine, because that's what people come to Durham to do. So by the end of that year, I was praying for close to 100 names, and that was just this scratching the surface of a community that's several hundred to 1,000 people strong, of people who go there or volunteer there or work there or love it. It's the most important thing in the town. Their whole geography is oriented towards where the cathedral is. That's how you know where you are, because you see where the cathedral is, right? If you're wandering around. And so I got to know them one bit at a time. In nonfiction writing and immersion writing, we don't do as many formal interviews, because our goal is to really get to know people and just spend time with them. So most of my research for this book was getting to know people, introducing myself, talking to them, following them around, making myself generally a pain in the butt. I got to know the archaeologist at Durham Cathedral, Norman Emery, fairly well. He was super kind about taking me to places that he's studying up on scaffolds, teaching me about the history of the place, showing me archaeological finds. And in return, I typed out his notes for him, right? And it was one of the things I volunteered to do there. Other people that I got to know stonemasons, right? People who carve stone for a living. Never in my life as a professor did I think that I would get to know stonemasons, right? But those are some of my closest friends. And so that's what I wanted to get at, is through this research and hanging around with people and following them and eating with them and drinking with them, I spent more time drinking that year than I normally do at all, right? Going to pubs, drinking with, say, stonemasons and vergers and whatnot. I also became part of that community and gathered this group of friends whom I love. And so now they're absolutely a part of this story that I'm trying to tell of this place and this community now and its history. And the only one other thing I would say besides the contemporary characters is right, that are in the book. There's also a bunch of historical characters, right? There's more than 1,000 years of history behind this place. And they're like crazy characters that come up. For instance, there was this monk who loved the body of the saint so much that he would like open his casket and brush his hair and beard every day, 600 years after he had died, right? So like, yeah, there's lots of really cool characters. And so that's the other thing, sort of balancing these people who are long dead and trying to understand them as characters with the people who are alive now.
Yeah, I would not have thought about bringing like the historical characters. I mean, obviously you're going to cover them because they're critical to the 1,000-year-plus history of this place. But to bring them to life, I mean, that does take some fictional skills. I'm hearing a lot of just how important this work is to both of you, of things that you work on, and your teaching, of course. I guess as professors and as writers yourselves, how critical do you think these creative writing skills of bringing characters to life, looking out into your settings and crafting stories, how important is that to people today, maybe who aren't actively students or actively writers, but it's a creative writing skill. How important is that today in our world?
Making art in any way is incredibly valuable, particularly during challenging times. I think it's a great outlet for people. One thing that I've discovered over the years, being an author, being a professor, just teaching various places, is how many people write, and often write secretly, right? And how many people that you really had no idea had any interest in writing come up to you one day and say, well, I have this novel that I've been working on. And I mean, it's amazing, like, how many people come up to me and tell me this stuff. When I was living in Southern California, I taught at UC Irvine for a while. And one of the courses I taught was a kind of, it's called a continuing education class or extension class, where I taught people in the community. And it was such an eye-opening experience because the students in this class, these were not students who were enrolled in UC Irvine. These are just anyone could sign up for it, right? There was like a dentist in my class, like a real estate agent, like just, and there were people who were in their 60s and there were people who were 24, and it was this mix of people, and it was one of my favorite classes that I taught, and I taught it multiple semesters. And then when I moved to Baltimore, I did a similar thing through Johns Hopkins where they had a similar type of program. I taught people in the Baltimore community. And, these were people who had careers, like they had families and they had these whole other lives, but at some point they never really satisfied that desire to kind of write that they'd secretly had, and now they had this opportunity. And it's just so exciting to see, and it just really opened my eyes up to just the world and how many people, as you walk around the world, like have these novels, right, or have these memoirs or essays in the back of their mind that they've always wanted to write. It's so many people. And so, I think for people out there maybe who've never shared their work, it's always a good idea to kind of look for opportunities to maybe take a class in the community or find someone you can share your work with, because I don't know, once you kind of make it public, right? Once you kind of admit this is something that I want to do, everything changes, right? And people out there listening, if you have that novel, right, or you have that memoir that you really want to tell, like, find someone to show it to, and that begins that process of making this interest a more public thing.
Not only is like wanting to write a story and create and be imaginative like such like an intrinsically human thing. We want to record not only our histories, but just our ideas and like things that we think are fun and silly. And like even as kids, like you go out on the playground and you're like, we're gonna do this story and we're gonna play this way. And, like adding the layer of bringing that to share with other people in a classroom format, or maybe just a colleague that you trust as an editor, of somebody like that brings people together, brings communities together to share these stories and work on those stories. So I think that was an excellent answer. I know you said you had a lot to say on the matter as well, of it's an important skill of just wanting to write. Did you have other things you wanted to add?
I just want to say and make the argument that reading and writing are the left hand and the right hand of something that's actually the most important thing that you could do with your time. And so you asked, like, if what we teach in a classroom to students is valuable maybe beyond just being a writer. And I think it absolutely is, right? I often think of teaching my students how to human before I teach them how to write. And so one example I would give is the ability to notice and to pay attention and to read a place and to read people. When we learn to read literature, right, we learn to read people and to understand people and to be able to intuit things about strangers and others and people and understand their most deep lives of these other people who are not ourselves. And that's profoundly a selfless thing, right? You're learning how to not be self-centered when you do that. And when you write, you're learning to pay attention, to notice your environment, to actually see what's there and what's happening, to actually see and understand people in order to recreate them on the page. I think so much in our moment at this time in this country and in this world would be different if people had those skills of entering into somebody else's life empathetically and consciously, of being able to notice the beauty and wonder and complexity of their surroundings. And so I actually think there's really nothing more important than you could do than to learn to write and learn to read and to practice those things. And I wholeheartedly agree with Andrew. If you're writing and you want to make that writing public, like, go for it, do it, put yourself out there. We all want to read what you wrote.
I can't think of better answers to conclude our episode on. Thank you both so much for being here and sharing those insights.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us. Thanks for letting us ramble a little.